definitely. I'm an associate director with the Arthritis Foundation. I work with our Northern California and Northern Nevada regions, but we are a national organization, and I know that a lot of you are joining us from all across the country today. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to learn. I am so excited that we have Dr. Nayak here with us today. She is a physician scientist who is dedicated to advancing care and treatment of patients with rheumatologic conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, RA, lupus, psoriatic arthritis, and other autoimmune diseases. And I'm sure she will do a much better job of introducing herself in just a few minutes here. So just a couple of housekeeping things. We are going to keep everybody on mute during the presentation. Feel free to use the chat feature to ask any questions that you think of as we go along. I will be keeping an eye on that and sort of, figuring out what questions we need to hand over to our speaker tonight at the end. So definitely, I encourage you to interact and participate. Our webinars have always been really valuable and awesome in the past because of people who are sharing and asking questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Nayak.
Thanks so much, Grace. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So thanks so much for inviting me to give this presentation for the Arthritis Foundation Patient Education Series, looking at the gut microbiome and diet in rheumatic diseases. So as Grace mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of medicine, and I'm a rheumatologist here at UCSF, and I see patients at the San Francisco VA, and I have no relevant disclosures. So the other thing is I'm a microbiome researcher, and I'm really interested in looking at how the microbiome interacts with the drugs that we give to our patients. I'm looking at the role of the microbiome in the treatment of rheumatic disease. But today I'm really going to focus on diet because so many of my patients ask about that, and they ask about the microbiome and gut health. And so I'm going to tell you what we know so far, which, we know some things, but there's still so much to learn. But before I get right into that, one of the things that I like to do is to define what the microbiome is, because sometimes different investigators have different definitions. And so the way that I define the microbiome is that it consists of the microbes. So that includes bacteria, viruses, fungi, and archaea, as well as the genes that they bring with them. And we're going to learn a little bit later about why those genes are so important, but it includes both the microbes and their genes. And there's actually all kinds of microbiomes. So of course, as humans, we're really naturally curious about the human microbiome. And as a rheumatologist, I'm really curious about the human microbiome. And in and on us, right, our microbiome that consists of the microbes that live in and on us, there's actually a different set of microbes that live in our gut and a different set of microbes that live in our skin, and they interact with our bodies in different ways. So there's like people who study the gut microbiome, which includes me. I'm really interested in the gut microbiome. Other investigators who look at the skin microbiome, all kinds of different kinds of human microbiomes. But there's also other places where microbes reside. And so there are other researchers that look at things like the ocean microbiome or the microbes that interact with plants, the soil microbiome. And one of the things that we've learned as microbiome researchers is that these microbes really shape the environments and the other organisms, the hosts around them. So these microbes are not just kind of like passive organisms, they're actually doing things to the plants or to the human or the host. And so I'm going to share a little bit more about that in the next few slides. One of the things that I learned to do really early on is to tell your audience what you're going to tell them. So I like to put like my take-home message right up front for those who maybe don't make it to the end or like have to go. And like my take-home message is there's still so much that we have to learn about how the microbiome and diet impacts rheumatic diseases. And so, one of the things is we need patients to, participate in the studies that we're doing. But I'm going to show you in, this slide why there's so much to learn. And it's because there's this complex interplay. So we know that the diet can shape the microbiome. And I'm going to show you some data to support that. So that's been kind of a recent appreciation of how much the diet can shape the microbes that live in and on our gut. We also know that diet can affect our own immune system. So there's this really cool field called immunometabolism that looks at how things like sugar and other compounds in the diet can shape the immune system. So when I think about diet, I don't only think about how it's shaping the microbiome, I also think about how it's shaping my own cells, my own immune system. So diet can affect both of these. In addition, our microbes actually help us harness energy from food, right? So our microbes will shape how we respond to the things that we're eating, right? So there's these reciprocal or bidirectional interactions here. And then there's also these interactions that our microbes can shape our immune system. And our immune system, of course, was designed to protect us against microbes. So because of all of these complex interplays, all these connections, there's a lot happening here. And so researchers like myself are interested in understanding all of these interactions. And so that's why I say there's still a lot to learn. But of course, I also, my patients are asking me, what should I do? And so what I like to tell them, while we're figuring all of this out, here's what you can do. And one of the things I kind of emphasize when patients ask me about how to use diet to help their rheumatic disease is I kind of emphasize that, we really need to take a holistic approach to the treatment of your rheumatic disease or to your well-being, right? So diet is an important component of that. And we're going to talk about that in the rest of the slides, but so is making sure that you're seeing your rheumatologist regularly, that you're getting involved with your primary care doctor, your physical therapist, that you're taking your medications. And if they're not working for you, telling us that, and us working together to find like a good regimen for you. So that's like the healthcare piece of it. But then exercise. I love to tell my patients that motion is lotion, that our joints become more flexible the more we move them. They stiffen up or they gel if we don't exercise. And I'm not saying go run a marathon or lift a bunch of weights at the gym. This is going to be like stretching and walking. And I like to introduce seated exercises for my patients because sometimes they don't realize that's a thing, and there's actually a lot of really good resources now online of videos of people doing seated exercises. So healthcare team, exercise, healthy eating, we're going to spend a lot of time on today. Getting enough rest, getting high quality rest, working to improve your sleep hygiene, thinking about, are you snoring at night? Are you having apnea at night? Investigating that, because those can also, if you're not getting good rest, can contribute to pain and suffering in rheumatic diseases. And then, of course, there is suffering for patients. And, I like to introduce mindfulness and meditation to my patients that are not familiar with it, because it can help us sort of process all of this pain and suffering. And so with that kind of caveat about, taking a holistic approach, let's jump right in now to talking about diet and the microbiome and how that contributes to rheumatic diseases. So some of you might be wondering, why is the microbiome important? When I first started studying the microbiome, I was very, I thought that was an important question to ask. And the way that we learned about the importance of the microbiome is we asked this related question of what happens when you get rid of it. And so I'm showing you here an isolator. This is a special kind of isolator in which we can grow up animals like this mouse here that doesn't have a microbiome. And so we call this a germ-free animal. And when we study lots of germ-free animals, one of the things that investigators a while ago had discovered is that germ-free animals are not the same as their colonized counterparts. Mice that have a normal microbiome are different than germ-free mice. And these germ-free mice are nutritionally underdeveloped. And so that's how we came to appreciate that microbes help us harness energy and nutrients from the foods that we eat. Germ-free animals also have a stunted immune system, and they're more susceptible to infections. And that's how we learn that our microbiome helps educate our immune system. And then also, I think what was surprising to many in the field is that animals that don't have a microbiome they actually exhibit neurologic deficits. They are anxious, they're hyperactive, they have learning and memory deficits. And so these are three really important ways that our microbiome contributes to our well-being. So our microbiome serves really important functions for the host. And these are just three. There's actually more that I didn't get into. But because of the importance of the microbiome and the functions that it provides to us as the host, we microbiome researchers think about the microbiome as extending the capabilities of our own genome. So all of these genes that they're bringing with them to help us digest our food and educate our immune system and everything like that, they are actually a second genome to our own genome. And if we understand more about them and the genes that they're bringing with them, then we can harness that to improve our well-being. So I like to kind of go over this slide about microbiome by the numbers. I think if you study the microbiome or you read about it in the news, sometimes you'll hear that there's more microbial cells in and on our body than our own cells. Some people will say there are just as many microbial cells as our own cells, but the bottom line is there's a lot of microbial cells on our body, and they're all over the place. They're in our airways, they're in our mouth, and our skin, our GI tract, and our urogenital apparatus. And I like to sort of highlight this, that sometimes we think about these microbes as being good guys or bad guys, but that's kind of like a black and white distinction that's not real. So sometimes these microbes can be beneficial to us, but in the wrong context, they might be harmful. And so really it's important to understand, what these microbes are and how they're interacting with the host. And there's not necessarily always going to be like a good guy and a bad guy. Each one of us has about 100 different microbes that live in our gut. And the collection of microbes that live in me is going to be different than in you or in your partner or in your child. And so each microbial community that lives in us is unique to us. And, they bring with them a lot of genes, right? So for every one of our genes that we have in our genome, there's 150 microbial genes. So there's 150-fold times more microbial genes in and on us than our own genes. And those are those genes that are encoding for enzymes and proteins that do all this important stuff for us. So this slide is just to indicate that there's a lot of microbes, they have a lot of genes, they're doing things to us, and we're still trying to figure all of that out, And so one of the cool things, one of the cool ways that a microbe in the gut can affect something like the brain, right, is that they're producing these things called metabolites. They're small molecules that, are produced in the gut, but can get into the bloodstream and go to places like the brain or the heart or the liver or the immune system. And some of these metabolites that are being produced, like tryptophan or short chain fatty acids, can regulate the immune system and can either ramp it up or ramp it down, right? And so understanding the exact ways in which the microbes and the metabolites that they're producing can do this is something that is being investigated by multiple research groups. One of the things that I emphasize is that our microbiome is personalized, right? And one of the ways that I learned this when I first started studying the microbiome is I was really interested in looking at the microbiome of patients. And so this was a study where we had looked at rheumatoid arthritis patients. And I was collecting stool from them and looking at the microbial communities in the patient's gut. And I was looking at what happened to their microbiome once they were put on methotrexate. So pre versus post here refers to what happens to the microbiome after the patients got methotrexate. And this is kind of a technical graph here, but each point here, I'm going to walk you through it right now. Each point here represents a person's microbiome, the community of microbes. And if points are kind of close together, like these two, the circle and the triangle, means that those microbial communities are similar. But if they're far away, like those, that means their microbial communities are different. And so each person's microbiome before or after methotrexate is connected by a line. And so one of the things that I learned was that each person's microbiome, their personal community of microbes, is very different from other people's, right? And then also, how each person was responding to methotrexate was very unique. Not, the way that their microbiomes were changing in response to methotrexate was very unique. And maybe this is why Some people are responders and some people are not responders, why some people have side effects to the drug and other people don't. And so this was kind of a really informative study that I did to understand how the microbiomes of patients with rheumatic disease are being shaped by things like drugs in this case. So I like this figure here, which shows that our microbiome is shaped by many things. So I was looking at a drug, methotrexate, but our diet can shape the microbiome. Where we grew up can shape our microbiome and the microbes that live in our gut. Whether we're young or old, like we know our microbiome changes with age. We know our microbiome is affected by our birthing process, whether we were born by a vaginal birth or a C-section, and whether we were breastfed or formula fed can impact our microbiome. And then, of course, also stress can shape the microbiome. So many things can shape our personal microbiome. And so with that kind of background, one of the sort of key lessons that I want to share in this patient education series is to emphasize that how you respond to a particular diet depends on your microbiome, right? So our diet can shape the microbiome, but because each one of our microbes, the community is different, and they kind of harness energy and nutrients in different ways, this interaction is unique in each one of us. And I'll show you that using two different kinds of studies, one in humans, which I'm showing you on this slide, where they suggest that microbes contribute to variation in diet response. So how we respond to a diet really depends on our microbiome. That's kind of the bottom line there. And in this study, this was an Israeli study where they looked at 800 people, and they measured a lot of things in those 800 people. They looked at their microbiome. They looked at various blood tests, including the blood sugar, which is, I'm going to walk through this graph in a second. They asked a lot of questions. They had the people keep a food diary. And what they did was really interesting. They gave these patients standardized meals, right? So they gave them a meal or a snack, and then each person is kind of getting the same meal or snack. And then they looked at how each person was responding to that standardized meal or snack. And so here's an example of that on the right, where they're looking at the sugar levels in the blood over time. And they looked at two people. This is participant 445 and participant 644. And what they did was they gave each of these two individuals either a banana or cookies. And if you had asked me before I looked at this study, which one of these, the banana or the cookie, would cause a bigger spike in sugar, I would have said the cookie causes the bigger spike in sugar. And that's actually what we see for this patient 644, that like the cookie causes a bigger spike at 30 minutes in the sugar level, right? And the banana really doesn't. But look at this patient or participant. This participant had actually a bigger spike in sugar with the banana than the cookie. And so these investigators went back and saw that the microbiome is one of the factors that contributes to this difference in response, right? So, if you're, it might be that a banana actually causes a bigger spike in sugar levels for a person than a cookie does. And so the microbiome may play a role in that. So that was a human study. There's a lot of things that you can't control for in patients, right? Like everyone may have different drugs that they're on, or different kinds of diets, or different kinds of, birthing methods, and so on. But you can get around some of that in mice. And so this was actually one of a seminal study done by one of my mentors, Peter Turnbaugh, where he looked in mice where you can control for all these factors. And what he did was he took germ-free mice. Again, these are mice that don't have a microbiome. And then he took microbial communities. These, again, are fecal samples. They're microbial communities either that had been exposed to a high-fat diet, right? So this is a microbial community that had been exposed to a high-fat diet, or a microbial community that had been exposed to a low-fat diet. And then he used these microbial communities to make the microbiomes of these mice, right? And these mice now with different microbiomes, they're on the same diet, right? And they're on a low-fat diet. And so you would expect that if they're on a low-fat diet, they would maybe have the same amount of weight gain. But that was not what he found. And then he found that the mice that had a microbial community that had been exposed to high fat, they gained more weight on the same diet as compared to mice that had a microbial community that was exposed to a low fat diet. And so this is kind of the schematic. Here's the actual data. Mice that had a westernized microbiome gained more weight from the same diet as compared to mice with a normal microbiome, right? So our microbiome really shapes the way that our bodies respond to a particular diet. And so, how do I think about these results in the context of my patients, right? So my patients will sometimes come to me and say, like, my friend said I should try the keto diet. It really worked for them, but it's not working for me. And I think that might be because your microbiome is different than your friend's microbiome, or your genome is different than your friend's genome. And so, the thing that I like to tell my patients is, like, you should listen to your body, right? Just because something works, like a diet works for somebody else, doesn't mean it's going to work for you. And that is also some of the sort of struggles that we've seen when people have tried to study different diets in patient populations. They'll study like a Mediterranean diet in a rheumatoid arthritis patient cohort in one country or geographic location, and they'll try to repeat it in a different geographical location. The results won't be the same. And so that might be because the microbiomes of these different patient populations are different, and they respond differently to the same diet. And it's the same thing that sometimes my patients will say, these foods are trigger foods for me. And that's not the case for some of my other peers that have the same disease. And that may be true. Like, maybe it's true that tomatoes may cause your arthritis to flare, right? But it's not the case that it'll cause everyone's arthritis to flare. And so we really don't understand what drives these differences in response to the same diet, whether it's because of differences in the microbiome or genetics, or even that the foods, right, that constitute these different diets are different, right? Like a banana in India may not have the same kind of composition as a banana in America. And so, the key sort of takeaway that I tell my patients is to listen to your bodies. Your body knows what things trigger your arthritis or cause a flare of inflammation in you. So that's the first lesson that I like to emphasize. That being said, I think that most doctors and other practitioners actually, while we can't tell you what to eat, right, because our microbiomes are personalized, our genomes are personalized, I think that we can all agree that there are certain foods, and whether to call them foods is kind of a debate, that are known to increase inflammation. And there are foods that are actually very prevalent in American society, in the American diet. So these are high-fat foods that are highly processed, and they're delicious because they contain kind of the perfect combination of fat and salt and sugar and like texture. And they're very available. But we know that these high-fat, highly processed foods can shape the microbiome. And some people think that it actually reduces the function of the microbiome or the diversity of the microbiome, although there's differences in that result. But that there is an effect of these highly processed, high-fat foods on the microbiome. And there's also really good evidence to suggest that high-fat diets can increase inflammation, right? So it can exacerbate disease. So I'm going to show you some data to support those sentiments, right? And I like this paper, this study that shows that Americans tend to eat diets that are high in fats and in processed foods. So this was a study of a nationally representative cross-sectional cohort of patients in the US. And when they asked these patients, like, where do they get their calories from? They said that almost 60% of their calories came from ultra-processed foods, and only 30% came from unprocessed or minimally processed foods, such as fruits and vegetables, dairy, and so on. And so, I think that you can make a big dent in the quality of your diet by reducing this, right? Those ultra-processed foods that are readily available everywhere, and trying to increase this, right? The minimally processed foods that are really nutritious. And I think that one of the sort of key things that I like to emphasize to my patients is really get rid of those ultra processed foods or the high fat foods and try to replace them with these minimally processed foods that are plant-based. And one reason, very important reason, is that we know that high fat diets make everything worse. They increase your risk of heart attack, stroke, depression, sleep apnea. They can affect the joints and cause joint pain because of just mechanics, right? The high fat diets increase your risk of obesity, and that causes a lot of pressure on the joints and so on. It can increases your risk of cancer. So high fat diets, high fat foods are a big portion of the American diet, but we already know that they are doing all these really bad things. So they also can change our gut composition. So this was a study done in mice. And again, these kinds of really technical plots are meant to represent a microbiome composition, and dots that are close together are more similar in composition. The microbiomes of mice that are fed a high-fat diet look different than the microbiomes of mice that are fed a carbohydrate diet. So we know that high-fat diets shift the microbiome. And then this is another study in mice, and I'm going to show you 3 examples of this because this is kind of a trend that we're seeing, right? That high-fat diet increases arthritis in mice relative to a normal mouse diet, one that is high in plants. And so that was one study. This is another study showing that a high-fat diet causes more arthritis, increase in joint circumference, the joint size, the joint swelling, as compared to a regular diet. And then here's one more example of that high-fat diet causes increase in arthritis score in these mice, in mouse models. And so I think that there is probably a lot of good evidence to suggest that there are certain foods to avoid. And so, while different physicians and rheumatologists will advocate for different kinds of diets, whether it's what Dr. Wales' anti-inflammatory diet or a Mediterranean diet, those kinds of recommendations will differ from doctor to doctor. I think every doctor or dietitian or integrative health specialist will agree that that patients should avoid foods that are known to cause inflammation, such as highly processed or calorie rich but nutrient poor foods, like what I'm showing you here. Okay, so that is like one thing. I can't tell you what to exactly eat, but I can definitely tell you what to avoid or try to eliminate from your diet. The third thing that I think that I advocate, and I think a lot of other doctors advocate for, is to increase the diversity of foods that you eat. And the thinking here is that increasing diversity of the foods that you eat will increase the diversity of the microbiome, which is thought to be a good thing. And that it also may be beneficial for reducing inflammation. But I say this not with like a lot of evidence. There have not been a lot of studies that looks at the diversity of food groups and how that shapes rheumatic disease. And so this is really a recommendation that's based just on expert guidance. And when I think about when I ask other rheumatologists what they advocate for in terms of diet, and they tell me, like it's Dr. Wales' anti-inflammatory diet or Mediterranean diet, or here's from the Arthritis Foundation, like these, I think there's a common element here, which is that all of these recommendations advocate for diversity of nutrient-rich foods. And a lot of that is based on minimally processed fruits and vegetables, beans and legumes. This is Dr. Wales' anti-inflammatory diet, healthy fats, fish, and things that are sweets or alcohol very minimally, And this is another thing, supplements. I get asked about whether patients should take certain supplements. And I would say that most of us say that you should get your vitamins in your diet, that is really the most effective way to get, the supplements that we need to promote our well-being. And then, the anti-inflammatory diet from the Arthritis Foundation, includes fish, fruits and veggies, nuts and seeds, and beans and olive oil and other healthy oils. I want to highlight this study by Dr. Monica Guma at UC San Diego. It's called the ITIS diet to improve rheumatoid arthritis and to impact the microbiome. And this is kind of a diet that's a supercharged Mediterranean diet, and includes things like a homemade green drink made out of green vegetables and fruit every morning, oily fish such as sardines, salmon, and tuna twice a week, a high daily intake of monounsaturated fatty acids from avocado, nuts, and sesame seeds, and so on. You can kind of read that. And this information is actually on a webpage on the Arthritis Foundation website. You can also get the preprint online for this paper. But in this study, what Dr. Guma and her colleagues did was they took 20 rheumatoid arthritis patients that had active disease, like swollen and tender joints, and then they put them, those 20 patients, on this diet for 2 weeks. So before the 2-week period, and then 2 weeks after being on this diet. And then they looked at inflammation and arthritis pain in these patients. And what was cool was that even just after 2 weeks of being on this diet, patients reported a decrease in disease activity as measured using 2 different scores. And then they also reported a decrease in pain. And so these are very exciting results that I think are promising, but I think that Dr. Guma would agree too, that like additional studies in larger cohorts of patients would be useful, and then also including kind of a control group. So, but that's a wonderful, I think, start and very promising. So, if I'm advocating for patients to eat healthy and to increase the diversity of foods and increase fruits and vegetables, I also like to tell them strategies about how to make it easy to do that, because we're all really busy, we're running around, oftentimes at the end of the day, our brains are really tired, and there's all this processed food around us, right? So it's really easy to make that choice to eat a bag of chips or a brownie at the end of the day when you're really tired. And so how do you combat that, right? And so one of the things that I like to do is to pack snacks. So I put an apple in my book bag, or a bag of carrots, or, here are a few examples of some really cute little snack packs. When I'm cooking at home, I think it's a little bit hard to get to the supermarket regularly and make sure that I'm getting fresh vegetables, because sometimes I'll get them and then they'll stay in my refrigerator for a while. But cooking with frozen vegetables, I think, is a strategy that has been effective for me and my patients, because frozen vegetables oftentimes are just as healthy and also just as tasty as fresh vegetables. And then they just last in your freezer for a longer time. And a lot of times they're also already chopped up, which I know sometimes my patients with painful joints have a hard time chopping their vegetables, but if you get these frozen packs and cook with them, a lot of times those are already ready for you to go. So another way to make things easy is to find inspiration. I find that I was already eating healthier this week because I was looking at all these resources to put in here for my talk. And, and it just put in my brain, all of these really easy recipes that, Arthritis Foundation has on their website. You can find so much of this stuff online. And then Arthritis Foundation also has these really great podcasts where dietitians and nutritionists and microbiome researchers talk about their, recipes or suggestions for how to eat healthy. And so I think, finding inspiration, talking with each other about strategies, to promote healthy eating is one way to make it easier on yourself. The other thing is to think about your eating as a lifestyle change and not as a diet that you're on, and to be mindful of what you're eating. So I really like these kind of figures here and strategies about mindful eating, that you're watching what, you're kind of looking at what's on your plate. You're looking at the colors, you're feeling the texture of the food in your mouth, you're chewing thoroughly, you're eating slowly. And when you really think about, I'm a healthy person, I'm not on a diet, but it's important for me to eat healthy, then you start to have a better relationship with food, and you're not on a yo-yo diet, and, eating healthy becomes more sustainable, and it lowers stress because you don't feel like you're cheating, right? It's just you're trying to be more healthy. It's not like you're making a big error in terms of a particular diet that you're on. And so with that, I am going to kind of end the talk and just summarize again the take-home messages. So number one is that, our microbiome is very personalized, and the way that each one of us responds to a diet is individualized and personalized. And so we're learning about this field called, just like we have personalized medicine, there's also personalized nutrition. And most of this, I would say, has really focused on healthy individuals, but we need better personalized nutrition for patients with rheumatic disease. And that's where, you know, Arthritis Foundation and like participation of patients in our studies is going to be really helpful. Things like the ITIS diet, those kinds of studies are going to be really what is going to advance personalized nutrition for patients with rheumatic disease. But while we're figuring this out, there's a few things that you can do, which is to try to avoid highly processed foods and replace them and find strategies to make it easy for you to replace highly processed foods with things that are healthy and that are colorful and that are like minimally processed and that are going to be good for your immune system and good for your microbiome. And share that with the people in, you know, that are your colleagues and your friends and your peer groups. And so, yeah, I think with that, I am happy to kind of end my lecture and happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There was one question that came through the chat. This is pretty early on, but I didn't catch which slide was up when it was asked, but they asked, is that called the leaky gut syndrome? So maybe what is leaky gut syndrome?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. So one of the sort of important functions of our gut is to be a barrier between the microbes and our circulatory system and our organs, right? And so the gut lining is an important barrier, the skin is an important barrier, but sometimes that barrier loses its integrity. So it's no longer an intact barrier. And so when that happens, then we think about the gut being leaky. So now those microbes that are supposed to stay in the center of the gut, in the lumen, right? They can now translocate, go in from the lumen into the circulation and go to other parts of the body. So that is a leaky gut syndrome is kind of indicative of an abnormal state of the gut where it's more permeable and can let microbes go from a location where they're supposed to be into a location that they're not. And we do know that patients with autoimmune diseases sometimes have a leaky gut. Certainly people with inflammatory bowel disease, that's sort of a mechanism of inflammation there that leads to things like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. But we have some evidence that patients with rheumatic disease can also have leaky gut. And so when that happens, microbes can actually lead to pathology, can lead to disease in patients. But yeah, that is one of the ways that microbes can influence the immune system is by directly going from from the gut into the host circulation into different locations. But I would say that's different than when the microbes are in the gut, but they're producing these small molecule metabolites. So when they're producing these small molecule metabolites, it doesn't, the barrier of the gut can be intact. It doesn't have to be leaky, but those metabolites that they're producing, the microbes, can still get into the circulation and affect other organs. So I think the bottom line there is that microbes can act on the host in many different ways. One is by going through a leaky gut, like a leaky barrier, but then other ways are by producing small molecule metabolites that can affect other organs.
Very, very interesting. Another question came through that asked, did the methotrexate clinical study look at whether or not patients were on folic acid?
Yeah, actually, so in all these patients were here at UCSF and also at NYU. And the standard practice here in the US is for patients to be on folic acid when they're on methotrexate. So yes, all of those patients were on folic acid at the time that we're doing the sampling. And it's a good question because sometimes people will scientists will ask, right? Like, can methotrexate affect the microbiome, even if you don't have folic acid on board, or if you do have folic acid on board? And we can't ask that question in patients because at this point in time, it would be unethical, right, to put a person on methotrexate but not give them folic acid. But we did that study in mice, and we found that whether we treated mice with methotrexate, and then we looked at their microbiome, and whether those mice were on folic acid or not, methotrexate did affect the microbiome.
Fascinating. Another question just came through. I know the gut-brain axis is a fairly new research topic that is emerging, especially as it is defined as bidirectional. So to what extent does this axis play a role in the bodily connections that were talked about in one of the slides?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of ways as well that the gut microbes can affect the brain. So one is metabolites, but then there's another mechanism called the vagus nerve, which is a nerve that can go from the gut to the brain, and microbial things can actually be transported along the vagus nerve.
Mm.
And what we know in patients with rheumatic disease is a lot of times the pain that we're feeling is what we call centralized pain, meaning it's not always inflammation in the joint, right? There's something that our nervous system is sensing that's separate from the inflammation. And so, is there a role for the microbiome in contributing to that? So like, is the microbiome contributing to our perception of pain independent of like what's happening in the joint, independent of inflammation that's happening in the joint? And I don't think that we know the answer to that question, yes or no. We also don't know the mechanisms, but I think other investigators are kind of looking at the role of the microbiome in Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's, and we know that the mechanisms there include some of the things that I was talking about earlier. I think we still are learning about that axis in patients with rheumatic disease and with arthritis.
Great. Another question asks, is the high-fat diet in the experiment referring to a typical Western diet versus processed food high-fat diet?
So the mouse studies that I showed, they're not feeding the mice things like chips or Twinkies. But they are kind of changing the pellets. The mice eat pellets, and then the composition of those pellets will be high fat, and it'll be things that are kind of like Crisco fat, that's in the pellets. And so it's not like a typical Western diet that humans eat, but it is a high fat diet that is contributing to the increased inflammation in those mouse studies.
And is there a way to test for leaky gut?
Yes, in the sense of looking for markers of inflammation or blood in the gut. So sometimes in our patients, we'll send something called a fecal calprotectin that can help us understand if there's inflammation in the gut. So that doesn't necessarily tell us if there's leaky gut in the set, of whether microbes are going from the gut into the circulation or into the body. But the fecal calprotectin will tell us if there's inflammation in the gut.
Okay. I've been in the Forward database for years, but are there other studies we can join to help others? That's a great question.
So usually, what I would recommend is wherever your hospital, like whatever, system you are a part of, if they're doing clinical trials, those are the best ones for you to participate in, because those are the studies where they'll have all of your information, all of your medical visits, and then they can tie that to what's happening to your microbiome. If you're not near like a research medical center, then I don't know right now whether there are people like microbiome researchers studying the microbiome that are looking at other sites other than like their local medical center. So, the website to check for, because now we're required to report all of our clinical trials, is to look on clinicaltrials.gov. And to look for whether there's a study that's happening near you that might be able to enroll you in a study and collect your samples and also your medical information.
Awesome. So check clinicaltrials.gov. Do most rheumatologists now recognize food and the microbiome's impact on arthritis?
I think most rheumatologists will advocate for eating a healthy diet. Most rheumatologists will have a idea of what they think is a healthy diet. And like what most rheumatologists know for sure is that patients with rheumatic disease, one of the leading causes of death in general, but also in rheumatic disease, is heart disease. And so a lot of rheumatologists will tell you, eat a diet that's healthy for your heart. And oftentimes it ends up also, if you kind of like think about all the data that we do have, in theory, that is also what is good for your rheumatic disease. But, I think a lot of rheumatologists also struggle, right? With giving specific guidance, right? And so, we'll get here patients saying, I want to go on a gluten-free diet. Is that a good idea? I want to go on a keto diet or a paleo diet, or, I want to go on an elimination diet. And the truth of that is that we as rheumatologists don't have a lot of studies or evidence to support, that one diet over another. And when there have been diet studies that have been done, sometimes, there are some like kind of preliminary, or like they're done multiple times and there are different results in every study. So that's kind of the struggle that we have right now as rheumatologists. And I think that, it may be because like some of these things are because when we're doing these diet studies, right, we're not taking into account the microbiome. We're not taking into account like a person's genome, right? And so that may be why, like these different studies have different results.
Definitely very interesting. I have a question, and I don't know if this is on anyone else's mind, but when we talk about processed foods, you have the picture of the hamburgers and French fries. Are there other types of processed foods that, like packaged foods, granola bars, sport Cliff bars, things like that might seem to us to be healthy, but actually aren't? And how do we, are there any tips of how to determine and make that distinction between what is actually good for you or what we should actually still try to avoid?
Yeah. Again, this is kind of like expert guidance, but, like look at the list of ingredients and then like, can you recognize all of those, right? That's one criteria. In addition, like look at the amount of added sugars, right? Like, then that that's not like natural, right? It's processed because like added sugars have been added. And it's nice that like a lot of foods now have that information, right? And it's clear and it's like big. That's kind of one of the things that have changed in the past 10 or 15 years. But I would say those two things, right? Like, can you recognize the ingredients? Is there added sugars? And then a lot of times things that are like just a few ingredients that you recognize, those are kind of better. The best is like obviously, fruits and vegetables and stuff like that. But yeah, I think that sometimes, life is really hard and it's really busy, and like sometimes it's those kinds of snacks that are available to us. And
Yeah,
a lot of
absolutely.
choice. Yeah. And so like these, I think, are the guidelines that I would recommend.
Awesome. That's super helpful. I know, for me, it's like you're saying, it's just easy to grab something that's in a package and you don't have to prepare it or anything. So I really appreciate that. If are there any other questions, feel free to type in the chat. We do still have some more time left. But while we're waiting to see if there are any more questions, I just want to mention that tonight's session is part of a year-long series. We've done this, I think this is the third year now, where we are doing virtual webinars to connect the experts with our Arthritis Foundation patients and constituents who are looking for this valuable information. And coming up later this year in August, we have a session on osteoarthritis. And then later in October, another session on integrative rheumatology, which always is really interesting too. So I'm not seeing any more questions come through the chat. Thank you for reaffirming that each person is different. Definitely. I think that was a really big takeaway for me too, is recognizing that not every diet is going to affect everybody the same way. That's huge.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like that's one of the things that I feel when my patients come to me and they're like, oh, so-and-so said that I did this to myself, or they feel shame about it. I'm like,
Yeah.
no, you didn't do anything. You're just like, you know, like you got some bad luck and,
Mhm.
you know, you're just doing the best you can, like everybody else, you know, like do not let somebody tell you that you can control your disease with like the diet that they're recommending, you
Oh,
know?
absolutely. I mean, I think it's really great that we're asking about the lifestyle things that we can do to prevent and improve our disease states, but that almost makes you feel like I'm doing something wrong, or I have done something wrong in my life to cause this to happen, and now I have to do everything I can to try to reverse it.
Yeah.
Um, Trying and failing at what has worked for others has caused me additional pain. So this point has been so encouraging tonight. I'm so glad to hear
Yeah, me too.
that. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up right there. Thank you so much, Dr. Nayak. This was super valuable. Your presentation, obviously is very well received. Everybody had awesome questions. We so appreciate your time with us and sharing your knowledge. If there are any follow-ups, you guys feel free to send me an email. Dr. Nayak had her email up on the screen too. Just let us know. We're here to help you. And I hope to see everybody at a future session. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye, everybody.